You're very patient. And what's different about this particular session, well, you'll notice something. The very first session I was preaching, and the second session I was sort of preaching and teaching, and this session I'm sort of leading a seminar. And it's not, I hope, because the spirit is slowly being quenched today, nor that I'm just getting really tired, though I do sometimes quench the spirit. I don't think I'm doing it to you. Each of these topics actually is I'm less certain about. See, for example, you need to preach gospel-centered, Christ-centered, life-changing, on-the-spot, culturally transforming sermons. I take a bullet for that. I'm not going to back off of that. You need to be in cities. Well, we're trying to show that there's a balance here. I would like you to really be concerned about cities as a group, but not necessarily all people feel like they're called to cities. Now, on this last one, I think it's time for you as a network. It's time for all of us as evangelical believers to be smarter about this subject. We need to start talking about it. I am not giving you words from Mount Sinai on this. I'm actually going to give you a few ideas I have about it. And that's the reason why I'm lowering my voice and why and I'm keeping my hands more to my side, because I don't want anyone out there who wonders or disagrees with me to feel that they're resisting God, because you're not. I'm just trying to move you forward, and this is much more of a seminar discussion. It's probably also going to be shorter so that we can have more time for question and answer, which is appropriate to a subject like this. I'd like to talk to you about how the church relates to the culture. And this is increasingly a problem in the Western world, because we have something that the rest of the world doesn't have, and that is we have a post-Christian culture. We have got a culture which is becoming more and more, you might say, anti-Christian, and yet in other ways they have some of the benefits of their Christian past. I've just actually bought a book. I haven't started reading it yet, but it's by a sociologist studying Denmark, I think, in Norway, or maybe Denmark and Sweden, and it's called Societies Without God. And the purpose of the book is to show that you don't need God to be a happy and prosperous society. They're saying, look at Denmark and Norway, the number of people who believe in God and who go to church is very, very small, and yet it's an ordered society. They care for their needy. It's a good society, and they say we don't need Christianity. We don't need God at all. But they also have a couple thousand years of emphasis on compassion. You have cultures. So let me give you an example. There's a man named John Somerville, he's just retired as a professor of history at University of Florida, and he's written a book that's actually a great book, Oxford University Press book, called The Decline of the Secular University. It's very, very short and actually a worthwhile read. And because he's a professor of history, he knows something, and that is the Anglo-Saxons that used to live around here really struggled with Christianity, because Christianity believed in forgiveness and compassion for the weak. And Anglo-Saxons said that's ridiculous. That is absolutely ridiculous. And if there's no way that a society filled with Christian belief could even survive, because society is built on respect. People are just going to overrun you unless people respect you. And the basis for social order is respect, and the basis for respect is fear. People have to be afraid. And this idea of forgiving and knowing that you're not going to get, just to know that I could commit a crime and not have my entire family drawn and quartered by the clan that I wronged, that's their idea of justice. The Christian idea of justice and the Christian idea of mercy and compassion was ridiculous, they thought. Absolutely ridiculous. So Northern European paganism, which is what was here before Christianity, was really pretty amazingly bloodthirsty, pretty amazingly power-hungry. And so Christianity comes along and absolutely changes people's attitude toward the weak, people's attitudes toward the poor, people's attitudes toward the marginal. And now, 1,500 years later, you've got society saying we don't need Christianity. We care for the weak, we care for the poor, we're orderly, we believe in the rule of law, and all those things which Christianity brought. And they say they don't need Christianity. They've robbed Christianity culturally of all their goods, and they've thrown God out. And then they're saying, see, you don't need Christianity to you don't need belief in God to have an orderly society at all. Okay, fine. Let's everybody be Christian for 2,000 years and then throw Christianity out, and then probably maybe it works. Now, what this means is increasingly we've got a new situation. The early Christians came into a real pagan society, and the pagan society was brutal to women. They did infanticide. They enslaved people. It was a brutal society. Christianity comes in, and you can read about this in The Rise of Christianity with Rodney Stark. Wrote a really great book about this. Christianity brought about a different attitude toward women, a different attitude toward class and race, a different attitude toward the poor, and it actually they put the pagans to shame. They created an alternate society inside the pagan society that was so much more. It was a healthy place. People looked in and saw more health, more growth, more joy, more harmony, and slowly but surely, it took 300 years. The Christianity won, and it increasingly became culturally influential, not because it sought power, but because it sought to serve. And it was so absolutely different than the society around it, because it was a human society based on service instead of power. That eventually it grew and grew and grew, and then eventually more and more people became Christians who were magistrates and writers and artisans and so forth, and eventually Christianity really became leaven and salt in the Greco-Roman world. Now, where are we now? First of all, we've got one problem, and that is, for reasons that I'm not, as an American, I don't want to quite go there. I know it has something to do with World War II. I know it has something to do with state churches. But Europe is almost the only part of the world in which Christianity is not growing very rapidly, as you all know. In many ways, it's a much more secular place. And yet Europe, of course, has been Christian the longest. And therefore, what you've got are secular societies that are living off, you might say, the capital, maybe I should even say the plundered capital of Christian civilization for many years. And yet Christianity has earned, perhaps, in many ways, the scorn of your countrymen, because there has been a great hypocrisy. There has been, the established churches to a great degree put emphasis on the rich and the powerful and the edifice and the establishment, and they didn't show care for the poor, and there was just a lot of hypocrisy for various reasons. You're in a situation now where European society is increasingly secular, and yet it's living off the capital of Christianity, but won't admit that it is, and therefore feels like you've got absolutely nothing for them. However, increasingly, I think you're going to find that the old problem of paganism, which was based on the idea of individual power, not service, is creeping back. In spite of the fact that you might say, socialism and liberal secularism has plundered Christianity for an awful lot of its values, nevertheless, at the street level, I think increasingly you're going to find that as Christianity recedes, we have a culture more and more based on power, exploitation, individual fulfillment. And for Christians to create countercultures that based on service rather than individual power and exploitation eventually will again become very, very distinct, very different. You'll look very much different than what you have in the culture around you. This is all good. In a way, I almost feel that Europe needs to really get non-Christian to be able to get back to considering Christianity again. It's in this odd state in which it's got so many of the, you know the word shards, it has the shards of a broken Christianity. It's got many of the benefits of Christian civilization. It has a lot of the refinements of it, and yet at the same time has lost the heart of it. So I actually find that talking to British people and European people about how do you relate to culture is really difficult and complicated. And I feel like any church like your own, your network, which is growing and you're really getting to be of significant size, you're going to have to start reflecting more and more on how you relate to the non-Christian cultures around you. Let me suggest there are 3 wrong ways to go, and let me give you the most basic outlines to the right way to go, and then we'll talk. The wrong way to go, by the way, a lot of this stuff is actually in the handout, but again, I'm not going to the handout. I'm just giving you. And these 3 things are not there. Right? Let me give you 4 phrases. 3 wrong, 1 I hope right. Defensive against, wrong. Purity from, wrong. Relevant to, wrong. Faithful presence within. Okay. Defensive against, purity from, relevant to, and faithful presence within. Now, all these terms are from a book that hasn't been published yet by a friend of mine who's a Christian sociologist named James Hunter, who teaches at University of Virginia. So that's my acknowledgement to him. But let me tell you what these first 3 are. Defensive against is triumphalism. It is marked by certain people, at least in the United States, that would be called the Christian right. Defensive against is an attitude that largely through politics, we need to take back the culture by essentially taking Christian values, Christian concepts, and making sure the law upholds them. And this is our way of honoring Christ, because there shouldn't be a distinction between private and public. You shouldn't just be a Christian in the private world, you should also be a Christian in the public world, and the way to do that is for Christians to get back into really the corridors of public power, and you should, especially in politics, and we need to get Christian values legislated and out there. That's defensive against. Purity from are people who say Christians shouldn't have anything to do with trying to reform society in any way at all. Now, there's a couple of different versions of this, you know. You have what we call I could call the neo-Anabaptist, which is the idea that Christians ought to form these little countercultures that care about the poor but should have nothing to do to try to salt society. Because if the church, they would say, tries to make society like the church, all that will happen is the church will become like the society. If you try to make the world into the image of the church, you'll only make the church into the image of the world. And there's some historical evidence for this. That's the neo-Anabaptists. They would be in the tradition of the Mennonites and the Church of the Brethren, etc. But you've also got just the old-fashioned conservative evangelical pietism that says our job is to evangelize souls and to disciple people, and we really, as Christians, we shouldn't have anything to do with the world because everything in the world is going to burn up except souls, so let's win souls, and that's it. And that's purity from, let's stay away. Then relevant to. And relevant to is an approach that says, oh my gosh, Christians are so out of it. They're so culturally irrelevant. We need to make sure our music and our message and the way we dress and the places we are really culturally relevant. Now, unfortunately, sometimes that means hip. You know, and rather, you know, I can't be self-righteous. The only reason I'm not into relevant to is I'm too old. You know, Mark Driscoll is in danger of being relevant to. He knows that. He knows all about it. At least that's not one of my temptations. I couldn't even if I tried. But there is a danger with relevant to. Yeah, there's some advantages of getting creaky and old. The relevant to is always been the problem of the part of the church that says we're out of it. We're just out of step. You know, modern scholarship, modern thought. We're out of it. We've got to get updated. And of course, relevant to. Notice I'm being very careful. Some of you are going to probably press me and ask me for examples. And one of the troubles is that whenever you use these kinds of, I think for thinking about this, it's good to have these categories. They're what they call heuristic devices. It helps you think of your world. If you actually think of individual examples, churches and leaders, many of them don't exactly fit into one category. They're largely in this category. So this is my way of looking at what's out there and trying to give you 3 alternatives that I see that I think are all pretty wrong about how the church should relate to culture. Now, the last one is faithful presence within. Look carefully. Look at the word, first of all, presence. There's a difference between being present in the culture and trying to take it over or trying to be absent from it. Presence means this. Presence means we are willing and able to take our people into, we're not keeping them out of the financial world. We're not keeping them out of the art world. We're not keeping them out of the academic world. We're not keeping them out of TV and movies. We're not keeping them out of cities, difficult places to live. We're going to be all those places. We're going to be there. But we're just going to be there and serve. See, instead of saying we're going to take back the culture, what I really would say is, my goodness, make sure that 20 or 30% of your churches, going back to saying, I don't want all the churches in the city, but if you find that you've got 2% of your churches in a big city, put 20 or 30% in the big city and just encourage people to be there and to be in all the parts of the city, to be serving the poor in such a radical way. I mean, this actually happened once. I once heard somebody, a non-Christian, say that church is doing so much for our neighborhood that even though I don't believe what they believe, I'd hate to see them leave because if the church left, we'd probably have to raise taxes. Now, even though that person says, I don't believe what they believe, I'll tell you something. There's a person who, if you're the preacher or you're a pastor, or you're a member of that church and you want to talk to them about the gospel, that guy will give you the time of day. He will listen to you. Why? Because you're present. You're there. You're not just meeting in the neighborhood. You're in the neighborhood. But that also means that you'd have a fair number of Christians in the media, which we don't have. That you'd have a fair number of Christians in the in movie making. You'd have a fair number in the art world, not just in the neighborhoods helping the poor. You just be there. And secularism tends to make people selfish. And religiosity and moralism tends to make people tribal. But if we can show, here we go back to the 3 ways to live, if we can show that what Christianity does is it turns people into servants, fearless servants, people who are not afraid of the city, not afraid of the culture shaping spaces, not afraid of these places, deeply present within, and with a heart to serve. If you seek power rather than service, you'll never get power, nor will you serve. But if you seek service rather than power, people will offer you the power. They'll ask for your opinion. They'll seek they'll give you influence. So you got to be present, you see, rather than taking over or rather being absent. Let me look at another word, and that is within. Rather than creating all of your and Christians do this, instead of creating all parallel Christian institutions, be willing to, as much as possible, get into the schools, get into the institutions with Christians and support the Christians there. Now, how do you do that? This is where your churches have got to become better and better, and so does my church, at helping people integrate their faith with their work. Let me suggest that this idea of being within is very hard on your... Wait. Let me confess something. I was trained to disciple people, but the only way I know how to disciple lay people is by increasingly pulling them out of their world into my church. See, the more discipled they are, the more the more advanced they are in discipleship, the more I'm bringing them out of their world, out of their job, out of their vocation, out of their involvement in the world, and more into my church. And so, I mean, in the early days of Redeemer, when we would win actors to Christ and businessmen to Christ, they would come and ask me questions like, well, what's the what's the biblical view of short selling? And, you know, first of all, my attitude was exactly what almost all of you are saying, and that is, what's short selling? You know, of course, in the financial world, what it means is you make a lot of money betting against companies instead of investing in them, betting that things will go bad, and punishing them if things do go bad. Or an actor would come and say, what do you think of method acting? I said, well, what's method acting? Well, see, in method acting, when you have a part that requires you to be angry, you don't act angry, you actually get angry. What do you think of method acting? And I say, well, that doesn't sound good. But that's about as far as, I mean, and well, he says, you know, is that right for a Christian? And what kind of roles can I take? I mean, what kind of stories can I be involved in and tell? I don't know. I want to teach you how to lead a Bible study and eventually become an elder. I want to take you away from all that. Well, does that really fit, you know, with what the Bible says about what God said to Adam and Eve? Go out there and make a culture that honors and glorifies God. You know, John Piper, I remember once, actually, not too long ago, actually said something pretty amazing to me. He says, you know, he used to always say all the Christians need to be, you know, evangelizing and discipling and not out there writing books and making movies. You know, that's, you know, all right, but, you know, okay, you can have a job, but just tithe. You know, the rest of us are really doing the work of the kingdom. And till he began to realize, you know what, if there's no Christians writing books, making movies and television shows, after a while, people aren't even going to be able to understand me when I talk to them about the gospel, because they won't actually have the concepts. They won't have the furniture. The culture will be so apart that, you know, I'm going to have to give people a week of training just before they can even understand a gospel presentation. And therefore, what does within mean? It means that you have got to find ways of training your people to integrate their faith with their work, how to shape the way in which they work by their faith in the gospel. And that's going to be part of your discipleship program. There's got to be a way of discipling people to stay within the culture and not to withdraw from the culture and to come into your church. You've got to find ways of celebrating and lifting them up and making them sense that what they're doing is important, instead of making them feel like they're second-class citizens because they're not sold out for Jesus the way you are. So faithful presence within. Oh, faithful. What's faithful? Well, faithful is pretty important, and that is the danger of getting involved in cities and the danger of getting involved in cultural institutions is that you instead of you changing them, they change you. And when Jesus says you are salt of the earth, a salt that's lost its savor is useless. Well, what does that mean? It means, on the one hand, Christians are supposed to be out there in the world, and salt was what? Preservative, medicine in ancient times, and seasoning. You know, that means that we're supposed to be out there serving people, changing people, being leaven and salt in the culture. But if you lose its savor, meaning if you really stop being salt, you're nothing but, I don't know what, sand, I guess. And the trouble with doing what I'm telling you is it's tough for people not to start to suck up to people, suck up to the culture, want to be accepted, and start to compromise biblically. Faithful presence within, faithful against the relevant to people who are afraid of looking different because you want to be updated. Present versus triumphalism and taking over, just present. Within, see, rather than purity from and staying away and saying, well, when we disciple you, we'll take you out. And I think that's the basic outline of the kind of stance toward culture, not triumphalism, not separatism. And I know it's pretty general, and you got 100 questions, so let's get to them.